Did you know that what you put around a quilting design is almost as important as quilting the design itself? In this video, I'm going to give you 4 things to think about when picking filler to put around your quilting designs. These 4 things will help you highlight or hide your designs depending on how happy you are with them. As a part of the Free-motion Challenge Quilting Along, we've been quilting feathers, and in the last video we quilted some feathers in the background area of our quilt. Now we're going to pick the fillers that we want to put around that feather. When picking the fillers to put around your quilting designs, you need to think about how much contrast you want between the design and the filler. And contrast is basically just a fancy sounding word for difference. So if I want my main design, such as the feather, to show up more, I'm going to use designs around it that have a lot of differences to it. If I want to hide it, I'm going to put stuff around it that's very similar and less different. Now there's 4 different ways that you can get contrast to your quilting designs. There's the thread color that you use, the shape of the design, the density of the design, and the direction. If all 4 of those are different than the main design, then you'll have a lot of contrast, really making that design pop. If all 4 of them are the same, then it's going to help blend it in. I have a quilted sample that will show you exactly what I mean. I've quilted the feather the same along the whole area, but what I've put around it is slightly different. And it's really going to illustrate how important it is to have contrast in your filler designs. Now the first thing we talked about, the different thread color. Now that's not exactly on this sample, but it makes sense, right? If your feather is quilted with a hot pink thread and you use a white thread around it, you're really going to see that hot pink thread no matter what kind of design that you do. So changing thread colors is the first and easiest way to make the design pop. But perhaps we don't want to change thread colors for our quilt, or perhaps the quilt we're working on calls for just one thread color. So let's look at this example for the other 3 ways to provide contrast. On this end of my big beautiful feather, I'm using a filler that is similar in shape. It's round and curvy like the feather, and the density is slightly smaller than the feather itself, but not a whole lot. Feather kind of blends in more than it will when I show you the other examples. Now as we move along the feather to this section, we have that same shape, we have that same design, that swirl, but the density is much smaller. Now density just refers to the spacing between the lines, and so here I have the bigger feather, the smaller filler, and that's going to make it pop. Now moving along, we see that I've kind of got crazy with the filler and put in those pebbles. Now the pebbles have a similar shape kind of. They're still round and curvy, but they're a lot tighter curves than the swirls. It's nice and dense, really helps that feather pop out even more. Then we move on to the furthest example of the feather. Around it, I have some really dense back and forth lines. They're much more dense than that big feather. They're also a different shape. They're more linear, more straight lined, and more importantly, they're a different direction. This feather is moving horizontally where these back and forth lines are moving vertically. It's almost as if I'm saying, hey, check this out. This is pretty cool right here. This is definitely not a design that I'm going to put around a feather that I'm not super happy with. I have another example where we can see this in action with thread color that matches the quilt top. It's the same exact illustration, just with a different type of design. In this beautiful green area, I've quilted the Swirl Chain design. If you want to learn how to quilt it, I do have a video that shows you how to do this. There's our Swirl Chain. You'll notice my filler is very similar in shape because it's more swirls. It's very similar in density, and it pretty much helps that Swirl Chain blend in. Now, I would probably do this if I didn't want the Swirl Chain to stand out too much. Maybe I want it to be more of a subtle element. Or maybe I quilted it and I thought, you know what, that didn't turn out like I wanted it to, then I can fill in around it and hide it. Moving along, we can see that I started moving into serpentine lines as fillers. Now the reason that they work is because they're going in a different direction. Even though they still are curvy a little bit and they're the same density, having that different direction is what's going to help kind of make it stand out a little bit more. So not quite so blend in, but not quite so in your face as the more extreme example. But once you get to the end, again, you can see those back and forth lines. They're really dense, they're going a different direction, and they're just really helping that pop. And that's even if I'm using a thread color that's closer to the fabric color. All right, I know you're thinking, more, show me more. Okay, well, even if you're not, just one more quick example. In this gray strip, I don't necessarily have a motif per se. I have some wavy lines with some filler, but in some of the areas, I decided to do a different filler to kind of make this main area stand out. Now what I have here are overlapping ribbon candies, which are really fun to quilt, but we'll get into that in another video. It's another example of a design that has a different direction. So even though it's still curvy, it's not a whole lot more dense, it does have that vertical direction and it subtly lets it stand out, but not too much. And then here, another example of those serpentine lines on either side, a little bit more subtle, different direction, but still same density. So the idea is whatever you put around your design is really what's going to help highlight or hide it. So let's go back to the feather that we're quilting for our challenge. If you remember, we quilted that feather in the background area and we left some space on either side so that we could fill in around it with different designs. Now that you have a few things to think about, you can pick your filler designs based on how much you love the feather that you've just quilted. If you bought the thread collections and you're quilting along with the same thread colors, I'm hoping that you used the pink to quilt your feathers, whether it's the pink in the Glide or the darker pink in the Aurifil thread collection. If you're wanting to hide your feathers, I would use the same color of thread as the filler. But if you quilted your feathers and you're like, dang, Angela was right, these are easy, I really want everybody to see them, then you can pick one of the other two colors. If you want something a little bit in the middle of the road, like you're thinking, I want to tiptoe into that pool of awesome, but I don't want to jump right in, then go ahead and use a slightly darker, the yellow or the light pink. And the reason is not because it's different from the background, but because it's closer in color to the element that we quilted. And since I have my feather in the brown, I really want you to be able to see what I'm doing. As much as I want to use the pink and the light yellow, I'm going to stick with the tan so that you can see what I'm doing. All right, let's get quilting. If you're looking for a design that's pretty similar to a feather, your best bet is going to be a swirl. It has that nice curvy look, and you can decide how dense to make it. Right now, I'm going to quilt it a little bit bigger, making it more similar in size to the feather. Let's look at a couple other designs that you could quilt if you're wanting to make the fillers more similar to your feather. You could do just a regular meander, or you could do a loopy meander. As you begin to fill in your background areas, there's a chance you're going to run into some tricky areas. For instance, inside of these swirls. I always say that people will notice a gap in the quilting before they notice an error, so make sure you fill in those areas with whatever design you feel like quilting. While filling in all these irregular shapes can be a little frustrating, you're really going to appreciate knowing how to do this when you start working on other kinds of quilts. Trust me, you'll thank me for this one day. If you're quilting along with me on the panel, as you start to run into this area with the design, just go ahead and work around it, leaving it unquilted, because we're going to come back the very last week and talk about quilting in that area. Echoing is also another great way to highlight your design. Echoing almost acts like a parenthesis, separating the design itself from the filler. So I'm going to go ahead and echo around my feather, then fill in the space between them with a different filler design. I'm going to fill in around the smaller feathers with a design that's more dense and goes in a different direction. I'm using the wishbone design. It's kind of my favorite right now. I just love how fast the wishbone is to quilt and how great it looks next to other designs. Now, as you're quilting along your feathers, you're going to run into areas where you don't have a lot of space. So I'm going to use echoing to fill in that area. If I'm wanting to show off the feather, I'm going to make my echo lines closer together so that they're more dense than the feather. But if I'm not wanting the feather to really stand out, I might just quilt one echo line. Or use a design that's curvy and not dense, maybe like a basic meander or a loopy meander. Or if you're feeling adventurous, you could quilt a back and forth line. Now I'm going to quilt some swirls on my long arm, making them a little bit bigger to help make that feather blend in. If you're quilting along on the panel, go ahead and fill in the area around your feathers with the filler of your choice. If you don't have a panel, no worries. In the quilting diagrams, I give you instructions on how to mark your fabric so that you can quilt along with us. For the wishbone and the swirls and all the other designs that you see me quilting, if you check out the description box below, I have links to several tutorials where I show you how to quilt each of these fillers. And I'll see you back here next week on Monday to talk about quilting feathers in irregular shapes. Now, in the meantime, if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. And like every week, I have quilting diagrams with tips and tricks. You can find all of that in the description box below. And I hope you do download them because I want to give you everything that you need to be successful with the designs that we're learning. Well, I'll see you next week. Happy quilting!